Keenan Booker walked into Harvard's lab with no backpack, no voice, and no friends. Just eyes that noticed everything. 30 minutes later, a racist professor humiliated him with a fake unsolvable problem, meant to mock his silence. Keenan didn't lift a pen. He didn't say a word. But what he did next exposed the biggest academic lie in the Ivy League. And the whole world saw it happen, on camera. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The first day of Harvard's prestigious early STEM advancement program carried the sound of wheeled suitcases, whispered ambitions, and overconfident laughter bouncing through the stone corridors. Among the crowd of excited, mostly white teenagers dragging their dorm keys behind them like trophies, a quiet figure stood motionless beneath the campus archway. Keenan Booker, 16, thin-framed, hands tucked inside the sleeves of his oversized sweatshirt. He wore no school-branded hoodie, no digital watch tracking his steps, no earbuds funneling music into his world. In fact, he carried nothing at all. No suitcase, no backpack, just a folded piece of paper, his acceptance letter slightly creased, clutched with reverence like scripture. His shoes were old, his presence was invisible. Around him, the campus buzzed. Parents snapped photos in front of the ivy walls. Future engineers and coders sized each other up. And professors walked briskly past, murmuring names they already deemed promising. Keenan was not among them. No one noticed the boy who never introduced himself. No one made space in the circle of eager students comparing AP scores. He wasn't a part of any group chat formed weeks before the program began. His silence unnerved them. Or perhaps they simply found it easier to laugh at than try to understand. By lunch on day one, a nickname had already taken root. Mute. It spread quietly, behind backs and in between chuckles. Mute's gonna invent the silent computer. One student joked, drawing laughter from others. A white girl from New Jersey whispered how creepy he looked, always staring but never saying anything. Another boy mimicked his stillness behind his back during a seminar. Professors, including the charismatic and condescending Dr. Merrill Langston, laughed along without correcting anyone. Dr. Langston, a celebrated Harvard theoretical mathematician, had developed a reputation not only for his complex proofs, but for his intolerance of mediocrity, which often seemed to coincide with students who didn't look like him. His brilliance was undeniable, but so was his disdain for affirmative action mistakes, as he privately referred to certain enrollees. Langston had scanned the early enrollment list weeks before the program began. Keenan Booker, Baltimore, public school, scholarship, no extracurriculars, no recommendation from anyone he knew. A lone letter from a guidance counselor attached with the vague note, "Keenan is gifted, but prefers to work alone." Langston scoffed when he read it. Another silent charity case, he thought, probably good at memorizing formulas. He already had a game in mind for kids like that. And as it happened, the orientation ceremony was his favorite place to play it. Inside the auditorium, the air was thick with ego. Students sat upright, postures stiff, notebooks ready. Keenan took a seat near the back, isolated. He didn't write, didn't move. His eyes scanned the board where Langston was already sketching a cluster of equations, as part of his icebreaker. Langston called it the 30-second challenge. Students would volunteer to walk to the board and attempt a rapid derivation of the problem. It was part performance, part pressure test. 3 students attempted it, each failing with polite laughter. Then Langston turned. "Let's try someone quiet," he said, voice rising theatrically. Heads turned. The smirks began. "I see you back there," Langston continued, pointing toward Keenan with faux encouragement. "Why don't you come try?" A few students laughed audibly. All eyes locked on Keenan, whose head lifted slowly. He didn't react, didn't blink. The silence stretched. Langston held the chalk out toward him. Keenan didn't move. It was the longest 10 seconds of the day. Langston chuckled and dropped the chalk on the tray. "Ah, the strong, silent type," he quipped, turning back to the board with dismissive amusement. "No worries. Not everyone's ready for the stage." A few students clapped ironically. Keenan stayed seated, still silent, eyes fixed on the equation. Later that evening, the dorm hallways were alive with controlled chaos. Students rushed to set up lab schedules, form study pods, and sync their calendars with peer mentors. Keenan didn't attend the welcome mixer. Instead, he wandered to the edge of campus, where a glass-walled math building overlooked the Charles River. The room was empty, lights dimmed, but the whiteboards inside shimmered under the moonlight like a siren call. Security footage would later show him stepping into the room, standing before the board for 12 full minutes without touching a thing. Just staring. No pen, no phone. Then he sat cross-legged on the floor, pulled a crumpled page from his sweatshirt pocket, the orientation equation, and simply looked at it. The next morning, a few students shared a blurry image in the group chat. Keenan sitting alone, on the floor beneath a glowing board, still motionless. The caption read, "Still buffering." The meme spread like wildfire across the dorms. Mute.xes, they called him now. His silence had become entertainment. But not for everyone. Rodney, the black custodian who cleaned the East Labs every night, had noticed something off. He'd watched the footage too. Keenan hadn't moved because he hadn't needed to. Rodney had seen the eyes of genius before, wide, tracking, absorbing, not in classrooms but in the eyes of kids wrongly written off. That night, Rodney paused outside the same glass-walled room. Keenan was gone, but something was different. The bottom corner of the whiteboard glowed faintly. Someone had dragged the heel of their shoe across it, smudging out a complex notation. Rodney stepped in, crouched, and stared. In the dust of the chalk tray traced with a finger was a quiet solution, not to the orientation equation, but to a deeper version of it. An extension. A variation even Langston hadn't considered. Rodney took out his flip phone, snapped a picture. Elsewhere, Langston was dining with faculty, recounting the orientation joke. I pointed him out, said wanna try, and he just stared like I'd asked him to speak Mandarin. He laughed. The other professors chuckled politely. Sad thing is, they always come through the same programs. They act like just being here is a win, Langston said. These kids get in on press releases, not proofs. The table laughed louder this time. Outside the restaurant, a student assistant was smoking a cigarette near the faculty lot. She had overheard it all. Her name was Bryn, 19, white, from Ohio. She had been Langston's favorite until she asked a question he didn't like in seminar last semester. Now she quietly resented him, and the elitism he cloaked as excellence. Bryn pulled out her phone, scrolled through the student group chat, found the photo of Keenan in the lab. Her thumb hovered, then tapped save. Meanwhile, in the dorm hallway, two boys projected a video on their laptop. Keenan sitting motionless, set to circus music. Laughter echoed, but something changed in the air. Another student walked by, paused and looked closer. The video showed more than they'd seen before. A moment only a second long when Keenan looked directly into the camera and smiled. Not nervously, not weakly, knowingly, as if he knew the joke was temporary, as if he was already 3 moves ahead, as if they were exactly where he needed them to be. Dr. Langston publicly mocks Keenan during orientation, inviting him to try the problem on the board, and Keenan doesn't even stand. The smirk Keenan gave to the hidden dorm camera lingered long after the video ended. It wasn't just a flicker of amusement, it was something colder, more precise. A signal almost. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. That look said everything. You're laughing now, but not for long. That night, while the other students crowded dining halls and dorm lounges, Keenan walked the quiet edges of campus again, unseen by the same institution that claimed to welcome minds like his. His footsteps traced patterns of thought, unsolvable to others, but familiar terrain to a boy who had learned early that solitude wasn't a weakness. It was armor. Inside the science building, janitorial lights buzzed dimly overhead, as Keenan stepped into Lab 6C, the same one with glass walls facing the river. He didn't turn on the overheads. He didn't need to. He pulled a black Sharpie from his hoodie, stepped to the massive window overlooking the city skyline, and uncapped it. His hand hovered over the glass, still for a moment, then began moving in deliberate arcs and lines. No hesitation, no scribbles, just sharp angles and long curves, symbols from multiple disciplines, embedded with meaning few could decipher. And with every stroke, his mind drifted back, not to the problem on the orientation board, but to the years that shaped him into the boy who never raised his hand. In the Park Heights neighborhood of West Baltimore, brilliance didn't earn applause, it earned suspicion. When Keenan was 8, he corrected a teacher's math on the board. She didn't praise him, she sent him to the hallway for disruption. When he wrote algorithms in his spiral notebook instead of classroom notes, he was called defiant. When he refused to play dodgeball during recess, and instead read library books about fractals, the school counselor labeled him withdrawn. It didn't matter that he could solve problems the teacher couldn't. It didn't matter that he learned entire physics concepts off YouTube with a dial-up connection in the evenings. All the system saw was a quiet black boy who didn't participate properly, and so they documented him, not as gifted, but as a behavior case. His father, Marcus Booker, worked nights as a transit mechanic and days as a substitute teacher when he could. A single parent since Keenan's mother died from an undiagnosed heart defect. Another casualty of a system that ignored black pain. Marcus had learned early that survival in Baltimore meant outthinking danger. So he gave Keenan one gift no school ever could. He believed him. At home, their apartment had no internet for months, no working oven, and no reliable heat in winter. But it had books, shelves full of discarded textbooks Marcus found at school closings. Some were dated, some scribbled on, but Keenan devoured them like oxygen. By age 10, he was solving for X in his head before most of his peers knew the difference between perimeter and area. And still, the schools failed him. When Marcus fought to get him tested for gifted programs, the school pushed back. He doesn't speak up in class. He doesn't interact with his peers. We don't want to set him up for disappointment. Each word was a brick. Each meeting a wall. The psychologist who finally did evaluate him gave up halfway through, saying Keenan wasn't engaging enough to complete the process. So Keenan stopped trying to be understood. By age 13, he no longer answered roll call, just raised a hand. By 14, he carried a small black notebook where he rewrote every problem he'd seen solved incorrectly. At 15, while other boys chased attention, Keenan chased patterns, heat signatures, cloud formations, stock market spikes, the algorithm behind viral videos. And at 16, his IQ was estimated over 160 by a grad student who volunteered at a community program. She encouraged him to apply to enrichment camps, to show his work, to make noise. Keenan didn't want noise. He wanted accuracy. The Harvard summer program application was a dare to himself. He typed every answer without flourish. No inspirational essay. Just his math. Just raw, unfiltered logic. When the acceptance letter came, Marcus wept. Not out of pride but relief, because finally, someone somewhere had seen what he saw every day. But acceptance wasn't the same as belonging. And now at Harvard, even in a room full of brilliance, Keenan felt the same gaze he always had. Not admiration, but suspicion. He stepped back from the glass and scanned what he had written. Not equations this time, but a visual map of thought. It was beautiful, in a way most people would never understand. Not just math but theory layered on theory. Time compression functions, fluid modeling, memory storage simulations, nested inside pattern logic. He'd been building it since he was 13. A way to calculate not just what people thought, but why they refused to think deeper. Keenan capped the Sharpie and tucked it back into his sleeve. The night was silent, except for the soft buzz of surveillance. Unbeknownst to him, a camera in the corner had activated, motion triggered. Back in the campus security office, a bored guard scrolling through silent feeds sat upright as the monitor lit up. He leaned closer, squinting. A black teenager alone in a locked lab, holding a marker, writing on the window. That was enough. The guard reached for the radio. Yeah, I've got someone unauthorized in Lab 6C. Possible vandalism. Sending someone over. By the time the footsteps echoed down the hallway outside the lab, Keenan was still standing in front of the window, staring at his work like a painter, unsure whether the canvas was finished. The door swung open hard. Flashlight beams cut through the dimness. Step away from the window. Now. Keenan didn't flinch. He turned slowly, hands visible, palms open. Not in fear, but like he'd done this before. Because One officer stepped closer, eyes narrowing at the ink across the glass. You writing gang signs, he said flatly, not even curious enough to understand the complexity in front of him. Keenan said nothing. He looked past the guards, back to the formula, back to the beautiful proof of his own mind. And then something unexpected happened. From the far side of the hallway, a figure appeared, tall, black, janitor uniform, moving fast. It was Rodney. He didn't shout, didn't interfere. He simply stepped forward, looked at the window and said calmly, "That ain't vandalism." The guards turned. Rodney pointed at a specific section of the equation, a delicate spiral nested inside a vector path. "I've seen that before," he said, "on a coding paper. A big one." The younger officer looked confused. The older one lowered his flashlight. Keenan finally moved, not to defend himself, but to pick up a crumpled piece of paper from the floor. the same one he'd been staring at the day before. He handed it to Rodney. Rodney scanned it. The orientation challenge. Now cross-referenced with what Keenan had written on the glass. Rodney's eyes widened. He looked at Keenan with something few had ever offered. The boy in his life. Not suspicion, not amusement, but recognition.
"You solved it," Rodney said quietly. "In your head."
Keenan didn't nod. Didn't smile. He just turned, stepped past the guards, and disappeared into the hallway. The two officers looked at each other, then at the inked glass, and finally at Rodney, who was now holding a phone up, snapping a photo. Not for security, but for someone else. Security is called when Keenan is found alone in the lab. After hours, writing complex equations in Sharpie on the window glass. The quiet of the lab lingered like a question unanswered. After Keenan walked out past the security guards, the hallway never quite felt the same. The glass equations remained untouched for hours before being erased without comment, like a guilty secret. Rodney saved the photo, said nothing, and returned to his mop, but behind his eyes, something was shifting, a reckoning long overdue. By the following day, whispers trailed Keenan wherever he went. Not whispers of awe or curiosity, but confusion, suspicion, discomfort. The kind of energy that builds when someone refuses to play by the unspoken rules of belonging. In a place like Harvard, even a summer program was built on performance, polish, and pedigree. Keenan brought none of that, and now, thanks to a leaked video, he brought attention, the wrong kind. Dr. Langston had noticed. Not because he was curious about the boy, but because the other students wouldn't shut up about him. A few had begun calling him Equation Ghost, mocking the rumors that he'd solved something advanced without even writing it down. Langston didn't believe it, but what bothered him more was the way Keenan's name had become a distraction. A crack in the order Langston curated carefully, where brilliance was measurable and excellence looked a certain way, so he decided to settle it. Langston had long kept a private theorem, a deliberately absurd and unsolvable logic trap that he'd designed years ago to frustrate overconfident doctoral students. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't real. It was satire wrapped in complexity. A joke that looked like genius but led nowhere. No one had ever solved it. That was the point. It had a nickname among his inner circle. The Maze. Langston printed a fresh copy, walked into the 11 a.m. logic module, and handed it directly to Keenan. He didn't explain it in detail. He simply said it was for extra credit, an invitation to rise. His tone was even, but the look in his eyes was performative. A trap, disguised as encouragement. The rest of the class watched with thinly veiled grins. A few students exchanged looks. One leaned toward another and whispered just loud enough, "Let the black kid try." It wasn't meant as a compliment. Keenan took the paper slowly. He didn't flinch, didn't glance at the others. He folded it once, neatly, and tucked it into his notebook. The room moved on, but the setup had been laid. Later that day, as groups formed in the student center to compare notes and prepare lab projects, Keenan sat alone in the far corner, the folded paper untouched beside him. He didn't read it, didn't unfold it. He simply stared out the window at the quad where other students laughed and passed frisbees, acting as though meritocracy wasn't a myth. Dr. Langston observed him from the walkway above, satisfied. He believed Keenan wouldn't even attempt it. Or worse, he would try, fail, and be humbled. Either outcome served the same purpose, restoring order, reminding the room that not everyone belonged just because they arrived. What Langston hadn't expected was the silence that followed. Days passed. Keenan never mentioned the paper again. He didn't ask questions, didn't seek hints, and more importantly, he never returned it. The original intent, public embarrassment, began to fade, but the unease remained. Students began asking Langston what the problem meant. He gave vague answers. Just a challenge, he said. An optional exercise, nothing official. But the rumor had taken root. Some believed Keenan was stalling because he didn't understand it. Others began to suspect something else, that maybe he'd seen through the trick, that maybe the joke was on them. The racial undertones were never named aloud, but they ran beneath every conversation like an underground current. A few white students argued that giving Keenan the problem was unfair, because it set a different standard. Others said it was generous, a chance to prove himself. No one questioned the premise, that proving oneself was expected only of some. Keenan, meanwhile, began carrying the folded paper everywhere, not to read it, but almost as a symbol, at lunch, in the dorm library, at the edge of seminars. It remained folded, unread, like a flag he didn't wave, but wouldn't surrender. It unnerved people. Bryn, the student assistant who had begun quietly observing Keenan's presence, noticed it too. She watched how other students' eyes followed him, how even professors shifted their tone when speaking around him, their compliments hollow, their patience thin. It wasn't open hostility, it was something more corrosive, the assumption that he was somewhere he shouldn't be. One evening, Bryn sat on the floor of her dorm, scrolling through old files from Langston's grad program lectures. She stumbled across something strange, a scanned document from 2011 titled Conceptual Trap, Unsolvable Constructs in Logic Design. It was short, sloppily annotated, but the structure matched the problem given to Keenan. She read the margin notes. Maze as satire, for those who think they're smarter than they are. Her stomach twisted. It wasn't a test. It was bait. Elsewhere, Keenan sat alone in the second-floor study lounge, the folded paper now balanced on the edge of his desk like a dare. A group of students walked past behind him, laughing louder than necessary. One stopped, turned back, and lingered by the door. Keenan didn't look up. The student said nothing, just smirked, then walked away. By now, even the faculty were beginning to split. Some found Keenan's presence unsettling, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he refused to play along. He didn't network, didn't participate in discussions, didn't affirm their methods with applause. He simply showed up, observed, and vanished like fog. But Langston's discomfort grew deeper. He'd heard someone mention that Keenan had scored perfect marks on every diagnostic test so far. He overheard two grad mentors discussing the strange elegance of his computational modeling, and worst of all, Rodney, the custodian, had been seen chatting with a visiting journalist who'd asked about campus diversity. The situation was slipping, so Langston tried again. During an afternoon seminar, he posed a question to the class, a theoretical extension of the very problem he'd given Keenan. It wasn't a real lesson. It was another test, wrapped in a lecture. He paused dramatically after writing the core equation on the board. If anyone has insight into this, feel free to share, he said without naming names. Keenan sat in the back, motionless. His hands stayed folded. He didn't speak, didn't move. Langston's eyes burned into him, willing a reaction. But Keenan blinked once, slowly, then looked away. Langston smiled thinly, then turned back to the board. Didn't think so, he said under his breath. After class, Langston's assistant found him in his office, rubbing his temples. He seemed agitated, pacing. He hasn't even touched the paper, the assistant said. Langston grunted. Then he's proving my point, he snapped. Gifted kids don't stay silent. But he knew better. The silence was too intentional. It wasn't fear, it was control. The next morning, the folded paper appeared in Langston's office inbox. Not scribbled on, not answered. Still perfectly folded, still blank. Langston picked it up with shaking fingers. It was like holding a mirror and seeing no reflection. He'd handed a weapon meant to humiliate, and it had been returned untouched, transformed into something else. Not surrender, not refusal, but rejection of the entire premise. And that was worse, because it made everyone ask the question no one wanted to answer. What if the quiet black kid wasn't trying to prove he was smart enough? What if he already knew and didn't need their permission? Keenan nods silently, and walks out with the paper, but doesn't write a single word on it. The paper stayed folded, the maze remained unsolved, and the silence, it grew louder with each passing day. Keenan had returned Langston's impossible theorem without a single mark, not as surrender, but as defiance. And though no words were exchanged, the message echoed through the elite corridors of Harvard's summer STEM program, like a quiet scandal. A test had been issued, a trap had been dodged, and now, the students who once laughed in hallways began whispering in hushed, confused tones. But the whispers didn't evolve into curiosity. They hardened into ridicule. Inside Harvard's polished social ecosystem, exclusion didn't always come through insults. It came through invisible omissions, group chats, where names were left out, project teams formed in passing conversations, never had within earshot. Keenan, already quiet, was easy to leave behind. Too easy. His name never appeared on the dorm activity board. He wasn't tagged in photos. When sign-up sheets for peer labs circulated, the lines beside his name remained blank. He wasn't hated. He was erased. And yet he was watched. It began subtly. A girl in Langston's seminar posted a grainy photo of Keenan from behind, sitting alone in the dining hall, with the caption still loading. Others followed, snapshots of him walking alone through the quad, standing motionless near a lab building at dusk. No words spoken, no context offered, but always the same mocking undertone, that he didn't belong. What started as inside jokes among a few students grew into something crueler. An anonymous Instagram account appeared under the name @silence at Harvard. It posted only photos of Keenan, never tagged, never named, each one a still frame of his isolation, curated for humor. One photo showed him staring at a lecture board while others laughed behind him. The caption read, "Trying to solve racism with his eyes." Within a week, the account had 600 followers. No faculty intervened. Even those who knew looked away. And Harvard, the institution that prided itself on progress and equity, kept its posture straight and gaze forward, pretending nothing was wrong. In a classroom of rising stars, Keenan had become a caricature, the mute genius, the quota kid, the anomaly that made the brochures look inclusive. But no one wanted to speak to him. No one dared to understand him. Not until a window cleaner named Elijah noticed something strange. Elijah had worked campus maintenance for 8 years. His rounds unacknowledged by most. He was used to silence, but not the kind Keenan carried, not the type that seemed heavy, chosen and strategic. He had seen Keenan in the halls more than once, eyes locked in calculation, steps perfectly measured. On a Thursday afternoon, while emptying trash bins in the science wing, Elijah noticed a small piece of paper wedged between a radiator and the wall. Crumpled, almost intentionally hidden. He pulled it out, expecting it to be a discarded assignment. But something about it made him pause. The heading at the top read, "May's Construct, Langston Theorem Variant." Elijah didn't understand the math, but the name caught his attention. Everyone on maintenance staff knew Langston. He was the kind of man who looked past you when you cleaned his office, who never learned a single janitor's name. Elijah unfolded the paper. There were no answers on it. But on the bottom right corner, something was scribbled in pencil. A faint set of symbols, small and complex, spiraled into a tight cluster. It wasn't part of the printed problem. It had been added after. Elijah squinted, unsure what he was looking at. Then he turned it upside down and saw something else. It was a cipher, not random math. An embedded code, something intentional. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew who might. Later that evening, he found Rodney mopping the entrance of the dorm where Keenan stayed. Elijah handed him the paper. Rodney studied it for nearly a full minute before speaking. "That wasn't meant for Langston," he finally said. "That was meant for us." The weight of the statement hung between them like fog. Rodney had been watching the same pattern unfold. Not just the silence, but the surveillance. He'd seen the screen captures floating through students' phones. He'd seen Keenan walk past groups who fell silent just as he passed, pretending he wasn't even real. And now, with this scrap of paper, something clicked. This wasn't a story about a student who didn't speak. It was about a system that refused to listen. Across campus, students continued posting and whispering, but one post stood out. Brim, Langston's former favorite and now quiet observer, had taken a screenshot of the @silence at Harvard account and posted it anonymously on a student message board, along with a single sentence, "If this is funny to you, you're part of the problem." The post went semi-viral within the student community. Comments flooded in. Some defended the account. Others called it harmless. But a small, growing number began to question what they were laughing at. And why. One user commented, "I sat next to him in logic. He sees things before the board is even written." Another wrote, "Langston gave him a fake problem, and he returned it blank. That's not dumb. That's a message." Slowly the narrative cracked, but not fast enough. Keenan remained outside the social architecture, observed but unwelcomed. And yet, he moved deliberately, as though each step was a placement, each silence a sentence. Inside his dorm room, he began mapping a new design, not on paper but across the walls and post-it notes and strings of tape connecting concepts. It wasn't chaos. It was theory. He was building something no one had yet realized. A framework for how environments rewrite intelligence through bias, how silence becomes weaponized by the majority, and how genius, when unrecognized, is pathologized. It wasn't math. It was exposure. Back in the maintenance office, Rodney spread the crumpled paper beside a photo he'd printed. The chalk equation Keenan had written in the lab. The same pattern repeated in both, spirals nested inside vectors. He matched the pencil cipher to the glass proof. They aligned. It wasn't just a solution. It was a warning. Rodney turned to Elijah. He knew this place would come for him, he said, and he's already mapped how. That night, Keenan walked the outer edge of the science wing again. No backpack, no phone, just his hood up, eyes scanning the horizon, as though decoding something invisible. Inside the lab, Langston sat in his office, watching the Instagram account on a burner profile. He didn't like the recent posts, not because he found them cruel, but because they had become inefficient. The joke had become unstable. What he wanted was silence without noise, but now the silence was cracking. He opened a drawer in his desk. Inside, the returned paper, still folded, still blank, still undefeated, but he hadn't noticed the faint mark on the corner. An almost invisible spiral, drawn in pencil, deliberately placed, like a signal. Langston didn't see it, but someone else would. A black janitor finds the impossible paper stuffed in the trash, but something about it is off. Keenan stood once more inside the dim science wing, just as the sun slipped beneath the horizon and shadows climbed the walls like silent spectators. The hallway behind him was still, no footsteps, no voices, only the distant hum of vending machines and the flickering overhead lights. But inside this lab, this particular corner of Harvard, time slowed. He had returned to the same room where he'd left his chalk-drawn proof days earlier, erased now as if it had never existed. The board was blank, but the memory remained. More importantly, the structure remained. In his mind, mapped with brutal precision. He stepped forward and surveyed the floor, the way a composer might look at empty sheet music, or a surgeon at an unopened chest. Then, almost instinctively, he reached into his pocket and withdrew 3 broken pieces of chalk, white, yellow, and blue, scavenged from an abandoned tray in a forgotten seminar room. Rodney had followed quietly, standing near the door, broom in hand, saying nothing. The boy hadn't asked him to come. He hadn't even spoken. But somehow Rodney knew to be there. Keenan knelt on the polished lab floor and pressed the white chalk stub into the tile. The sound was soft, almost musical, the gentle scrape of genius revealing itself. No notebooks, no calculators, no references, just thought, just memory, just truth. He started with a spiral, the same symbol that had been penciled into the corner of Langston's discarded assignment. But this time, it didn't stand alone. Around it, Keenan drew vectors extending outward, looping back on themselves in calculated arcs. He used the yellow chalk to layer a gradient flow across the lines. And finally, the blue to mark 2 points where the logic collapsed. Rodney watched, transfixed. He couldn't decipher the math, but he understood rhythm. And this, whatever Keenan was drawing, had rhythm, a pulse, a language. Keenan finished with a small curved symbol, a bracket, intersecting the spiral's center. Then, without even brushing chalk dust from his palms, he turned slightly toward Rodney, his voice low but firm. For the first time in days, he spoke. The assignment, he said, wasn't real, not in the sense of scholarly integrity. It had no structural endpoint, no logical conclusion. It was a loop, a trap, constructed specifically to collapse under scrutiny, not to be solved. In essence, it was a lie that looked like a challenge. Rodney blinked, trying to follow. Keenan explained that Langston's theorem, the maze, depended on faulty assumptions. It included conditions that contradicted the foundational axioms of the system it claimed to operate within, which meant solving it was not only impossible, it was meaningless. A performance designed to expose the limits of students who didn't come from elite academic pipelines. In short, it was a gatekeeping device. Rodney looked down at the floor again, seeing not just symbols, but intent. The math wasn't just theoretical. It was political. It was personal. Keenan pointed to the blue arc, the precise point of breakdown in the logic. That was where Langston embedded contradiction under the guise of complexity. It was the mathematical equivalent of asking someone to describe a color that doesn't exist, and then punishing them for failing. Rodney stepped closer, eyes narrowing. He'd seen this tactic before. Not in math, but in management. In life. People like Langston crafted obstacles that couldn't be overcome, then used the failure as proof that the person never belonged in the first place. And yet, Keenan had seen through it. Not by attempting to solve it, but by refusing to validate it with effort. He hadn't lifted a pen, because he didn't need to. His silence had been his answer. But this chalk on the floor, this impromptu mosaic of logic and resistance, was the explanation. Rodney crouched beside the drawing, phone in hand. He hesitated, just for a moment, then snapped 3 photos. One wide, one detailed, one of Keenan's face. Not posed, not aware. Just focused. Keenan rose slowly, rushed his palms together, and turned to leave. But Rodney didn't follow immediately. Instead, he opened his phone's contact list and scrolled down to a name he hadn't touched in years: Lena Reyes. Lena had been a Harvard graduate once, back when Rodney was new to the job, and still believed things could change if you just kept showing up. She was sharp, bold, and the first person who ever spoke to him like he wasn't invisible. She went on to law school, then disappeared from academia. Years later, she resurfaced as a political podcaster, unapologetically radical, with a massive online following. Rodney selected her contact and typed a message. "You need to see this. Genius being crushed in plain sight." He attached the photo of the chalk design and hit send. Then, for the first time in weeks, he exhaled. Back across campus, Langston sat in a closed-door meeting with 2 faculty peers, complaining about disciplinary concerns and vague disruptions to the classroom environment. His words were careful, veiled, but every sentence pointed back to Keenan. He mentioned behavioral inconsistencies, failure to participate, potential dishonesty. He never named race. He never had to. The other professors nodded politely. But one, a soft-spoken statistician from the School of Education, asked a single question that made the air tighten. Has he broken any rules? Langston hesitated. The answer was no. He hadn't plagiarized. He hadn't skipped assignments. He hadn't violated any written code. But still, he disrupted. He existed outside the script, and that, to Langston, was unacceptable. Meanwhile, in the dorm, Keenan returned to his room and sat on the edge of his bed, hands folded. His walls were still covered in notes, strings, color-coded patterns. But tonight, they looked different. Not like theories, but like blueprint. He pulled a blank sheet of paper from his drawer and, for the first time in days, lifted a pen. Not to solve Langston's problem, but to begin documenting his own. Outside, the photo Rodney sent had landed in Lena Reyes's inbox. It lit up her screen while she was mid-interview with a guest on police reform. She paused, opened the message, and stared. Her expression changed instantly. Without missing a beat, she told her producer to cut the interview early. She had another story to run, one that didn't just expose power abuse, but shattered the myth of meritocracy. She opened her social media account, typed a caption: "A black teen at Harvard just dismantled a racist logic trap using nothing but chalk and memory. His name is Keenan Booker." The system tried to make him disappear. Instead, he decoded it. She attached the photo and hit post. The janitor secretly takes a photo of the floor proof and sends it to someone unexpected, a former Harvard alum who's now a viral podcaster. By the time the sun rose over Harvard Yard, the world had already changed, and Keenan Booker didn't even know it yet. The photo Lena Reyes posted, with its quiet defiance and cryptic brilliance etched in chalk across the floor of a Harvard lab, had ignited the internet like a spark in dry grass. No filters, no hashtags begging attention, just a raw image of a silent boy kneeling beside proof the world never asked for, yet couldn't ignore. Within 2 hours, the post hit 20,000 shares. Within 6, it was climbing Twitter's global trending list, under the hashtag #RunHarvardRacism and the Mute Genius. By nightfall, the image had been reposted by athletes, scholars, rappers, activists, and even a U.S. congresswoman, who captioned it, "This is why silence is never compliance. Sometimes it's protest." Across newsrooms, phones rang. Editors barked orders. Producers scrambled to book interviews. Who was this kid? Where was he from? And why had Harvard, of all places, tried to bury a mind like this? But Keenan remained exactly where he'd always been. Silent, still, and unreadable. Inside his dorm room, he sat cross-legged on the floor, notebook open but untouched, as the outside world tried to break through the digital wall that surrounded him. Emails flooded the student portal. Interview requests stacked up. CNN, NPR, The New York Times, Teen Vogue, local stations from Baltimore, international news from the UK, South Africa, and Brazil. Each subject line was a variation of the same breathless headline: "Black teen outsmarts Harvard professor." But Keenan didn't reply. He hadn't checked his inbox in 2 days. It wasn't a strategy. It was survival. The attention didn't flatter him. It unsettled him. To Keenan, truth had never needed validation from cameras or applause. And yet now, the world seemed desperate to turn his silence into spectacle. to give it meaning only because it had gone viral. Back in the lab, the floor had been scrubbed clean. Rodney stood at the glass door, the next morning, frowning as he stared at the empty space where chalk once exposed a lie. He knew what they'd done. The cleaning order hadn't come from facilities. It had come from above, quietly, urgently. They weren't cleaning chalk. They were erasing evidence. He pulled out his phone and checked Lena's page again. The photo was still live, but now her post had been flagged for sensitive political content in some regions. They were already trying to control the narrative. Inside Langston's office, the mood had curdled into panic. He had seen the post less than 30 minutes after it went up. The image hit him like a punch, not because it showed Keenan's brilliance, but because it exposed his own cruelty. The equation was unmistakably his. The room was his. And now his joke was trending worldwide as a racist parable. Worse, faculty members were beginning to ask questions. A few forwarded the photo with cautious messages. "Did you assign this?" Others said less, but the silence stung even more. They were distancing themselves. The tide was shifting. Langston slammed his laptop shut and paced his office. The problem wasn't Keenan's mind. It was that Keenan had refused to perform. He hadn't tried to solve the problem to please Langston. He hadn't asked for help, or complained, or failed publicly. He had returned the paper blank, and then quietly, in chalk, dismantled the whole facade in a language only the observant could understand. That kind of defiance was dangerous. Langston picked up his phone, voice tight, and requested a private meeting with Dean Carlisle. "Urgent," he said. "Policy breach. Security issue." In the administrative wing, the dean, a tall, polished man, with decades of political experience in academia, agreed to the meeting without delay. Not because he believed Langston's panic, but because Harvard was now sitting on a live grenade. By that afternoon, the university's public relations office had already drafted 3 statements. The first denied knowledge of any racial discrimination. The second praised diverse genius in the abstract. The third expressed concern about unauthorized lab usage. None were released. The language was being tested for tone, for optics, for deniability. Meanwhile, the student body had splintered. Some rallied behind Keenan, calling him a revolutionary, a genius, a symbol of intellectual resistance. Posters appeared around campus overnight, a stencil version of his face beside the words, "He solved it without writing a word." Others scoffed. In hushed dorm room chats and online threads, some students claimed the photo was staged, that Keenan was being propped up by activists, that the problem was never real, that merit was being diluted again. The backlash had begun. Even inside his own dorm, Keenan was now an object of fame and suspicion. People who'd never spoken to him now tried to catch a glance. A student tried to sneak a selfie beside him in the dining hall. 2 more knocked on his door, pretending to be from the school paper. Keenan answered none of them. Instead, he buried himself in thought. Not in equations, but in patterns. Not in numbers, but in structures. He began building a new model, not of math, but of power. Rodney, now more invested than ever, visited him late that night, and found Keenan rearranging thumbtacks and yarn on the wall like a detective in a noir film. The wall diagram had grown. Now it mapped not just the logic of the Maze theorem, but its implications, how systems introduce false challenges, disqualify the challengers, and then erase the evidence. Rodney watched for a while, then handed Keenan a printed page, Lena's article. Keenan took it, scanned the first few lines, then folded it neatly and placed it beneath his notebook. No smile, no nod, just a stillness. Rodney now understood to be his way of saying, "I know." Across the city, Lena appeared on a live stream panel titled "Excellence Isn't White," alongside a professor from Howard and a tech founder from Oakland. The conversation was electric, emotional, and blunt. Lena held nothing back. She named Langston directly, named the theorem, named Harvard. And she ended her segment with a line that would become a battle cry. This boy didn't just beat a problem, he exposed one. The clip exploded across social platforms. The pressure mounted. Harvard faculty convened emergency meetings, unofficial but frantic. They weren't trying to understand the issue. They were trying to contain it. And so, in a closed-door session the next morning, Langston laid out his request to Dean Carlisle. Keenan should be removed from the program. The reason? Unauthorized lab entry. After hours presence. Violation of academic procedure. He said it flatly, as though reciting a policy manual. But the venom was clear beneath the surface. Dean Carlisle said nothing for several seconds. He steepled his fingers, looked down at the desk, then finally met Langston's gaze. "And you're only bringing this up now?" he asked. Langston shifted. "I didn't want to escalate prematurely." The dean tapped his pen once on the table, then slowly leaned back in his chair. "We're not going to expel a child for writing on a floor," he said, his voice even. "Especially not this child. Not now." Langston's jaw tightened. "You know what happens if we do nothing," he said. "The media will own the story. The narrative will be ours to lose." Dean Carlisle looked at him coldly. "No, Merrill. We've already lost it. Dr. Langston calls a secret meeting with the dean, demanding Keenan be expelled for unauthorized lab entry. The dean's refusal to expel Keenan wasn't a victory. It was a warning shot." Langston left the meeting seething. His confidence cracked but not crushed. He knew the system wouldn't publicly back his move. Not now. Not while Harvard racism was trending. But he also knew something else about institutions. They didn't have to punish you openly to destroy you. They just had to wait until no one was watching. Within 24 hours, the retaliation began. It started with a closed faculty thread, an internal email loop among selected professors in the STEM program, subject-lined conduct concerns, early summer cohort. On it were Langston and 3 others, Dr. Preston, physics, Dr. Hargreaves, computational logic, and Dr. Finch, ethics and education. The tone was clinical. The message was clear. Student KB has exhibited multiple behavioral irregularities, including refusal to engage in collaborative learning, unauthorized lab access, and failure to submit proper work documentation. Another reply followed within minutes. "This type of individualistic defiance threatens the integrity of our program model. Consider proposing a formal review board." Keenan's name wasn't fully written, but the initials were enough, and the language was calculated, not accusatory, but coded. It painted him not as gifted, but as problematic. Someone leaked the emails. They landed on a student-run whistleblower blog, known for exposing institutional cover-ups. An anonymous source forwarded the thread with the caption, "Harvard profs are plotting to bury the black kid they can't control." The blog post dropped late Friday night. By Saturday morning, a second wave of attention erupted. Darker this time, less celebration, more outrage. The media that had once cheered Keenan's silent brilliance now shifted focus to Harvard's culture of academic gaslighting. Journalists dug deeper. They found faculty records showing Langston had previously been accused twice of retaliating against students of color who challenged him in class. The cases had been internally resolved. No punishment, no paper trail. Until now, Langston responded with silence, but his allies moved faster. Quiet calls were made. Old colleagues from publishing circles and institutional think tanks began circulating a new whisper that Keenan hadn't actually solved anything. That the chalk on the floor was decorative, that it was a publicity stunt engineered by outsiders. And then came the leak. A source provided a blurry photo of a near-identical equation, scrawled on a message board at a mid-tier university, years prior, suggesting Keenan's chalk design was copied. No context, no citation, just suggestion. Within hours, a new thread exploded on Reddit titled, "Was the Harvard chalk genius just a plagiarist?" The damage didn't need proof, just doubt. And doubt spread faster than truth. Some of Keenan's earliest offenders hesitated now. Social media turned cautious. The same commentators who praised him days earlier began adding disclaimers. If this is authentic, and assuming the work is original, the celebration morphed into speculation. Back on campus, Keenan felt the shift. People didn't laugh anymore. They watched him, warily, as if waiting for him to crack under the weight of their cynicism. But he didn't. He simply removed every post-it note from his wall, cleared the yarn lines, wiped the diagrams. Not out of fear, but focus. This wasn't about proving he was right anymore. It was about proving the system wrong. Rodney noticed the change immediately, when he visited Keenan's room the next evening. The boy didn't speak. He just handed him a sheet of paper. One sentence was printed at the top. "If silence can be weaponized against me, I will weaponize it back." Rodney nodded and tucked the note into his shirt pocket like scripture. But across campus, Langston wasn't done. A call went out to the university's Ethics and Integrity Office. A formal review was proposed under the guise of verifying academic originality and conduct alignment. The claim? that Keenan may have violated academic code by not citing theoretical sources in his floor demonstration. The absurdity of accusing someone of citation error for something drawn in chalk was not lost on observers, but to Harvard technicalities were weapons. Another leak confirmed what many feared. Harvard was preparing to launch a quiet academic integrity investigation, not public, not immediate, but shadowed. The irony was brutal. The boy who spoke no words was now being accused of stealing them. Keenan refused to respond to interview requests. He didn't show up to press conferences. When reporters tried cornering him near the dining hall, he turned and walked the other way. His silence, once inspiring, now enraged those who wanted answers. Headlines, redemption arcs. But he knew better. He knew the story was never about him. It was about who got to define genius, and who didn't. On Monday morning, a package arrived at the campus mail center. It was a thick manila envelope, worn at the edges, marked in black Sharpie. ATN, Harvard Summer STEM Office. Inside was a single folder. On the cover, FBI evidence. That same afternoon, a dusty old pickup truck rolled through the university's main gate. Its driver unmoved by the stares of students in Patagonia fleeces and designer sneakers. He parked by the faculty lot, stepped out slowly, and pulled the folder from the passenger seat. Marcus Booker didn't wear a suit. He didn't walk like a man trying to impress the Ivy League. He walked like a man who had nothing left to prove. Keenan's father had arrived, and the folder in his hands wasn't just paper. It was ammunition. Inside that folder were scanned documents, timestamps, and federal commendation letters, proof that at just 9 years old, Keenan had cracked a gang-related communications cipher during a community hackathon in Baltimore, that the code had been turned over to the FBI, that the agency had used his pattern to disrupt an illegal trafficking ring, that Keenan's name had been redacted from every press release, for his safety. But that wasn't all. Included were email exchanges between Marcus and the agency, months of pleading to get Keenan placed in advanced academic programs, months of being ignored, and then, an official internal note from subject displays anomalous pattern recognition ability. Recommendation, no further civilian exposure. Too unpredictable. They hadn't just ignored him. They'd buried him. Keenan hadn't stayed quiet because he was broken. He'd stayed quiet because he'd already learned that brilliance, when uncontained, became a threat. And now that threat had a file. Keenan's father arrives on campus, and he's holding a weathered manila folder, marked FBI evidence 20. Marcus Booker didn't walk through Harvard's iron gates to make a scene. He walked like a man on a mission, whose only concern was truth, not how it was received, not how it was polished, but how it had been buried. The manila folder under his arm was creased at the corners, the paper inside yellowed with time and weather, but what it held was radioactive. Inside the administrative offices, where the air was cooled and words were carefully chosen, Marcus stood firm in front of a student services clerk, who blinked at him with detached politeness. When asked if he had an appointment, he responded with a flat no. When she asked what his business was regarding, he simply slid the folder across the desk and said, "This concerns your silence." It didn't take long for the folder to travel upward. Within the hour, the dean was holding it in his office, eyes narrowing as he flipped page by page. There were scanned reports from a 2012 community coding event, held in West Baltimore, hosted by a non-profit tech outreach program. There was a name listed among the participants, Keenan Booker, age 9. A report detailed how Keenan, paired with 2 high schoolers, had identified a cipher embedded in SMS message patterns being used by local gang networks. The encryption was simple on the surface, but recursive, buried in slang and rotating character sequences. The adult organizers didn't even notice it. Keenan did. His notes, written in pencil on scrap paper, were scanned and included in the file. They were eerily similar to the spirals and arcs now seen in the infamous chalkboard photo, proof that his pattern recognition hadn't emerged recently. It had always been there. Another document, dated 2 months after the event, was a redacted FBI memo confirming the use of the decoded communication pattern to intercept illegal activity tied to regional trafficking. The operation was reported as a success without crediting the source of the discovery. Instead, an internal note flagged Keenan's anomalous pattern cognition and warned against putting his name in any federal publication, citing the child's background instability. The phrase echoed with quiet bias, a way of dismissing genius by labeling it dangerous. Marcus had kept everything. He had begged schools to review it. No one did. Because the story didn't fit. No administrator in Baltimore wanted to acknowledge that a 9-year-old black boy from a single-parent home had outsmarted government surveillance systems. And no federal agency wanted the world to know they relied on a child to clean up their digital blind spots. So they erased him. Now that erasure had come full circle. Rodney, standing outside the dean's office with arms crossed, knew what the folder meant. This wasn't a revelation. It was a reckoning. The system hadn't just ignored Keenan. It had intentionally buried him. Not because he wasn't exceptional, but because he was too exceptional, in a body they refused to celebrate. Word of Marcus's arrival spread through the student body like an electrical pulse. Some students who had mocked Keenan fell silent. Others scrambled to find out what was in the folder. Within hours, screenshots of the cover FBI Evidence 2012 were circulating across message boards and Twitter threads. Meanwhile, in Langston's office, the pressure was mounting. He read the same documents, handed to him by the dean's assistant, with a mixture of disbelief and dread. The idea that this child, this boy he had mocked, had already cracked government codes years before even entering Harvard, made Langston feel exposed, fragile. His identity, built on being the smartest man in the room, now trembled on the edge of obsolescence. He threw the folder onto his desk. "This doesn't change protocol," he muttered to no one in particular. But even as he said it, he knew everything had changed. Across campus in the philosophy building, a junior professor named Adam Sinclair sat in his office, scrolling through the same files on his laptop. He had received a confidential PDF, anonymously sent to his personal email, with no message attached, just a subject line: "Read this before they bury it again." Sinclair, one of the youngest white professors on faculty, had always felt the undercurrent of elitism in Harvard's halls. But this hit differently. He'd watched from a distance, as Keenan became both myth and meme, from silence to spotlight. But this file gave it weight. It wasn't about social media anymore. This was institutional betrayal, a system designed not to fail, but to exclude. He clicked through Keenan's early cipher notes, stunned by their clarity. Then he opened the FBI internal memo, the one that called Keenan unstable. He stared at the word. Then he opened his Twitter account, paused, and closed it. Instead, he opened an encrypted messaging app he used for whistleblower communication with reporters during a previous university scandal. He selected a contact named Cora, a freelance investigative journalist who had broken stories on Ivy League discrimination before. He attached the documents. Exclusive: Harvard child genius cracked federal code in 2012. Covered up by FBI, buried by academia. Source: unredacted file folder. This story isn't about what he solved. It's about what they erased. He hit send. Less than 10 minutes later, Cora responded: "Interview me. Tonight. We go public tomorrow." Meanwhile, Keenan sat in the far corner of a quiet study hall, unaware of the storm gathering just outside his silence. He didn't need to speak to know that something had shifted. He could feel it in how people avoided eye contact now, not out of scorn, but fear. The students who once mocked him were now unsure what he was capable of. And the faculty who once dismissed him now feared exposure. That was the power of truth. Once seen, it could not be unseen. That evening, Marcus stood beside his son in the dorm room doorway, scanning the wall where Keenan had once mapped complex strings of thought. It was mostly bare now, the yarn and thumbtacks gone. In their place was a single quote printed and taped to the drywall: "If they silence you, write louder, even if it's in code." Marcus placed his hand on Keenan's shoulder. No words passed between them. They didn't need them. Back in Sinclair's office, the phone rang. It was the Harvard Communications Department. They had learned about the leak. The voice on the other end was polite, but firm. "We're asking you to delay the story. For context. For review." Sinclair didn't reply right away. He looked down at the open email from Cora, which now included a draft headline set to publish at midnight: "The mute genius they tried to bury, Harvard, the FBI, and the child who solved everything." He clicked reply. One word: run. A young white professor finds out and decides to leak the full story to the press. The headline dropped at 12:01 a.m. "The mute genius they tried to bury, Harvard, the FBI, and the child who solved everything." By sunrise, the world had already shifted. The article traveled faster than Harvard's polished talking points could contain. It flooded news feeds, group chats, and academic circles across the globe. Within hours, it had been translated into multiple languages and reposted by everyone from celebrities to civil rights attorneys. The world wasn't asking whether Keenan Booker was real anymore. They were asking how many others like him had been erased. The article revealed everything. How Keenan, at just 9 years old, helped crack an encrypted messaging system used by gang networks. How the FBI used his discovery while keeping his name out of every credit line. How the institution supposedly built on merit had labeled him a discipline risk instead of a prodigy. How a professor at Harvard assigned him an impossible racially loaded problem and mocked his silence. How Keenan answered without a single word, only Harvard's PR machine moved immediately, desperate to regain control. The university's crisis team released a carefully worded statement, attempting to dilute the damage. They described the assignment given to Keenan as a misunderstood experimental challenge designed to provoke cognitive resilience in high-achieving students. They said the entire situation had been regrettably mischaracterized and reaffirmed their commitment to diverse excellence. It was all passive verbs in soft terms, a blanket of bureaucracy draped over a fire. But it was too late. The apology, if it could be called that, only fueled the fire. Black communities across the country, already weary of institutional gaslighting, responded with a force Harvard couldn't calculate. Keenan's name became a rallying cry. His face, silent, focused, misunderstood, was posted on murals, t-shirts, and protest signs. Social media birthed a new hashtag, Let Him Write. It didn't just symbolize Keenan's right to be heard, but every black child ever underestimated for not smiling enough, speaking enough, or conforming enough. Harvard alumni began speaking out. Some published essays in respected journals, condemning the institution's failure. Others rescinded donations. Admissions inquiries to the STEM summer program plummeted. Public pressure mounted. And Keenan? He remained silent. He didn't take interviews. He didn't tweet. He didn't walk into press rooms with microphones waiting. He let the world roar, while he remained a center of stillness. And the silence now had evolved. It wasn't quiet. It was power. In his dorm room, Keenan kept building. Not math proofs now, but something more dangerous. He was mapping institutional responses, cause and effect chains, probability shifts based on demographic heat. Rodney, who had grown used to the boy's brilliance, still found himself stunned by how Keenan processed attack into analysis. You see it all before it happens, don't you? He asked once. Keenan said nothing. But the answer was obvious.
Then came the email.
It arrived first in Harvard's development office, then forwarded to the dean, and finally reached Marcus Booker. The subject line was vague. Private offer, full sponsorship, K. Booker. The sender was not an academic or an activist. It was Roland Kellerman, a billionaire tech investor, known for building predictive behavior algorithms. His reputation was complicated. Philanthropist to some, opportunist to others. The offer was simple. A full ride for Keenan. Tuition, housing, research funding, equipment, all expenses covered at any institution of his choice. Stanford, MIT, Caltech, even private mentorship programs were on the table. No strings, he claimed, except one. Keenan had to leave Harvard. Immediately. Kellerman framed it as a matter of environmental optimization. He believed Keenan's genius was too precious to be left in a place now tainted by politics, media, and institutional paralysis. He called it strategic reallocation, but the condition was clear. Leave, disappear, start over, quietly. Marcus stared at the screen that night. His jaw clenched. It was the kind of offer most families only dream about. Financial freedom, academic protection, escape. But something about it felt too clean, too easy. He glanced at his son who sat on the floor, knees tucked under him, index finger drawing spirals in the carpet like he was already solving something the rest of the world hadn't caught on to yet. Then, for the first time in days, Keenan spoke. He asked his father a question. Quiet, but shh. If I take this, do they win? Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't, because he didn't know what winning meant anymore. He just knew he didn't want his son to be crushed by a world so afraid of him. Across campus, Dean Carlisle read the same offer and felt a bitter irony settle in. They had tried to ignore this boy, then discredit him, and now someone was trying to buy him out of sight. The dean wasn't sure what disturbed him more, the audacity of the offer, or the fact that it might work. Langston, meanwhile, remained in hiding. His office had become a bunker. Every news cycle dragged his name through deeper mud. Articles unearthed prior student complaints, veiled racist remarks in old academic papers, and a pattern of exclusion hidden behind high expectation. His colleagues stopped answering his emails. His name became a case study in what happens when institutional arrogance meets public accountability. But Harvard itself was bleeding now. Internally, applications were dropping. Externally, donors were hesitating. The media storm had reached Ivy League allies, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, and they began issuing their own statements to distance themselves from the narrative. Still, Keenan refused to speak to press. Instead, that night, while the world speculated and debated, he opened a blank document on his laptop and began typing. It wasn't a rejection. It wasn't a press release. It was something else entirely. A proposal. A mysterious donor offers to fund Keenan's full tuition. But under one condition. The proposal Keenan typed wasn't long. Just under 3 pages. It contained no emotional appeals, no soaring rhetoric, no language designed for viral consumption. It was clinical, clear and sharp, like everything else he created. It outlined a new academic model, one where students like him wouldn't just be accepted, but protected. A mentorship infrastructure, a mobile lab initiative, a publicly funded, peer-driven network where institutional gatekeeping couldn't suffocate brilliance. It was called Open Solve, a blueprint not just for freedom, but for ownership. Keenan didn't send it to Harvard, he sent it to the world. He uploaded the document to a public repository used by programmers and researchers. The link spread within minutes. It wasn't just a counteroffer to Kellerman, it was a challenge to the system itself. A teenager with no podium, no degree, and no voice on record, had just drafted a framework that even grad students admitted was revolutionary. But the spotlight grew hotter. Roland Kellerman, the billionaire behind the generous tuition offer, finally broke his silence during a live-streamed tech conference. Wearing his signature gray turtleneck and over-practiced humility, he described Keenan as a national asset and compared him to early Steve Jobs. He praised his silence as mystique and framed his offer as an act of noble mentorship. But he made a mistake. In trying to humanize the deal, he slipped. He revealed that he had already filed a preliminary patent application using a logic structure inspired by Keenan's spiral vector proof. Language pulled directly from the viral chalk photo. The crowd didn't notice. The press didn't catch it. But someone else did. Rodney, watching from the dorm lounge back at Harvard, nearly dropped his coffee. He rewound the video. Then again, the phrase was unmistakable. Spiral vector proof. It wasn't just mentorship Kellerman was after. He was trying to trademark genius he didn't create. Rodney rushed to Marcus's hotel room, slammed the laptop down, and played the clip again. Marcus didn't speak for a full minute. When he finally did, it wasn't loud. It was razor sharp. They don't want to fund him, he said. They want to own him. Keenan sat quietly in the corner staring at the screen. He already knew, but now his father did too. Later that night, Marcus and Keenan sat on the dorm balcony under the flickering street lamp. The boy's head was down, eyes tracing invisible patterns in the air. Marcus finally spoke. "This ain't about math anymore," he said. "This is about your name, your mind, and who gets to sell it back to the world." He told Keenan the truth. No brochure ever did. Brilliance in black skin was never just seen as exceptional. It was seen as exploitable. The system didn't want geniuses. It wanted products. And it wanted to own the patent before the world realized it didn't build them. Keenan said nothing. But something shifted in his posture. The next day, the Kellerman Foundation released a press release claiming ongoing conversations with Keenan Booker and his family. It named his potential future institution. It included terms. It mentioned private advisors. It even thanked Harvard for their cooperation in transitioning the young mind toward long-term stewardship. It was a lie. And it backfired. Because Keenan responded silently. He posted a single sentence on his newly created public page. "No one owns what they didn't build." The internet exploded. Support surged again, fiercer than before. And now, the story wasn't about what Keenan could solve. It was about what he refused to sell. News anchors debated his defiance. Professors dissected his proposal. Podcasters framed him as a prophet of a new academic era. The narrative had changed. And with it, so had the stakes. Then came the invitation. An executive producer from a major network reached out to Marcus with a once-in-a-generation offer. A national television broadcast where Keenan would be given the opportunity to solve a legendary unsolved problem. It was a mathematical riddle so complex that entire teams had failed to crack it for decades. The network promised no tricks, no editing, just one camera, one board, and the boy they couldn't stop talking about. But there was a condition. He had to solve it in silence, and refuse all questions after. No interviews, no commentary, no dialogue. Just problem and proof. Keenan read the offer 3 times. Then he folded the paper in half, and nodded once. Keenan is invited to solve a live problem on national television, but refuses to speak on air. The studio lights weren't warm. They were surgical. Sterile beams of white precision slicing through the darkness of the broadcast stage. Keenan Booker stood motionless under them, alone in a circle of sharp illumination that felt more like a spotlight on a courtroom witness than a stage built for celebration. No one stood beside him. No producer introduced him. No voice filled the silence to ease the tension. There were only cameras, dozens of them, fixed, recording, waiting, as if daring the boy to flinch. He didn't. In front of him stood a 7-foot-tall glass board, its surface pristine, anchored to the floor by steel brackets, etched faintly into the upper left corner. Visible only to the cameras and those watching the live broadcast, was the unsolved problem, a legendary 20-year-old logic construct, known as the infinity step. It was a riddle layered in recursive structures, paradoxes, and symbolic traps. Countless mathematicians, logic theorists, and computational analysts had attempted it. None succeeded. But that night, under blinding lights and the watchful eyes of millions, a 16-year-old black boy, who had never spoken on camera, was about to try. Keenan didn't look at the audience. He didn't wave or smile. He reached into the front pocket of his plain black hoodie and pulled out a stub of white chalk. Not a marker, not a digital stylus, just chalk. A choice that seemed both anachronistic and defiant. He raised his hand and stepped to the board, and then without cue, without hesitation, he began. The first mark was a spiral. One clean, smooth coil of chalk, clockwise, tight, deliberate, not part of the problem. It was a language of his own making, and those who had followed his story recognized it immediately. It was the symbol he had drawn on the lab floor at Harvard, a shape now synonymous with resistance, with clarity, with genius. Then came the lines. Long strokes, crossed arcs, nested vectors, not random scribbles, but logic, visual, abstract, alive. The cameras never cut away. There were no commercial breaks. The network had agreed to one condition: no editing. This moment had to live unfiltered. Keenan worked silently. His gestures were fluid, almost hypnotic. Each edition built on the last, a complex bridge of thought made visible to the world. Viewers sat transfixed. Homes fell silent. Schools paused classes. Watch parties in libraries and lecture halls erupted with audible gasps when he flipped direction mid-solution and introduced a mirrored inversion curve, something rarely attempted in real-time modeling. By the 7-minute mark, mathematicians were live streaming their reactions on social platforms. An MIT professor, speechless, simply held her hand over her mouth while tears gathered in her eyes. "He's not solving it," she finally whispered. "He's redefining the field." A Nobel laureate tweeted, "This boy didn't walk through the front door of logic. He built a new one." Back at the glass board, Keenan stepped back, took a long breath, then reached out again, this time using his fingers, not to draw but to connect. He traced invisible bridges between symbols, linking ideas the world had never thought to connect. He circled a node from the top left, drew a faint line to the lower right spiral, and then added a tiny curve beneath. A final dot. He set the chalk down. The board was now full, an intricate constellation of logic, symbols and meaning layered in silent complexity. Keenan stepped away. He didn't bow. He didn't look at the camera. He simply walked off screen. The broadcast didn't cut away immediately. The camera lingered on the board. Viewers stared. Scholars squinted. AI recognition systems kicked into overdrive. A coding algorithm at Caltech flagged the structure as a 93% match for the logic basis of an entirely new form of recursive computation. One of NASA's deep learning teams quietly downloaded the frame and began testing it against known unsolved models. But beyond the academics, something deeper stirred. In living rooms across America, black parents wept quietly. In classrooms in Atlanta, Detroit, Southside Chicago, and Jackson, Mississippi, black students stared at the screen, not because they understood the math, but because they understood the moment, the weight, the beauty, the clarity. In Baltimore, a group of neighborhood kids gathered outside a barbershop replayed the stream on loop, pointing at the board like it was the scoreboard of a championship game. In that moment, Keenan's silence was no longer absence.
It was power.
And then the final camera zoomed in. At the bottom corner of the glass, in the smallest handwriting, almost invisible, was a single sentence etched in chalk. Ask better questions. And then the feed ended. The world didn't exhale. It roared. The video shattered every online metric within hours. Clips flooded TikTok, YouTube, Twitter. Academic institutions posted breakdowns. Psychologists analyzed the impact of visual silence in learning. Artists recreated the spiral in murals. T-shirts appeared overnight bearing his final line. Ask better questions trended worldwide. Still, Keenan remained silent. He declined interviews. He ignored live broadcast follow-ups. He left the studio with Marcus, through the back exit, bypassing reporters, walking into the night like a shadow slipping through steel. Back at Harvard, the fallout deepened. Administrators who once pretended ignorance now scrambled to find neutral footing. The university had tried to separate itself from Keenan's broadcast. No sponsorship, no promotion, no official statement. But now the absence of acknowledgement became louder than the broadcast itself. And then came the second blow. A former faculty assistant, anonymous until now, published a thread online titled, "The Langston Problem." In it were internal documents, emails, notes, HR filings, evidence that over the last 7 years, multiple students of color had filed informal and formal complaints against Dr. Merrill Langston for racially biased behavior, exclusion from labs, and retaliatory grading, all quietly closed, all dismissed without external review. The thread went viral. Within 24 hours, Harvard's Office of Institutional Integrity launched an investigation into Langston's conduct. The once unshakable professor, whose reputation had shaped generations of STEM students, now found himself beneath a microscope. His colleagues distanced themselves. Past students began to speak out. Clips of his guest lectures were re-examined. His published papers were reinterpreted. And then Langston did what few expected. He filed a lawsuit against Harvard. The complaint alleged emotional distress, reputational sabotage, and willful neglect in preserving the dignity of academic contributors. Langston positioned himself not as the oppressor, but the victim, claiming the university allowed a media-fueled narrative to assassinate his character and academic record. The irony cracked across headlines like thunder. The same man who once mocked a silent black boy for not speaking had now weaponized silence as injustice, his own. News anchors covered the lawsuit, but struggled to make the public care. The Keenan broadcast was still fresh in everyone's minds. What Langston saw as betrayal, the world saw as karma. Even Harvard didn't offer its full legal protection. For the first time, Langston stood alone, because the world had changed, and it had changed in chalk. Dr. Langston is placed under investigation for past racial misconduct, and files a lawsuit against Harvard for emotional distress. The moment the lawsuit from Dr. Merrill Langston landed in the public record, everything shifted, but not the way Langston expected. Across campus, in offices lined with dust and whiteboards now empty, rumor morbidly, quietly began to leak. What started as a self-serving complaint by a disgraced professor became the lever that pried open years of silent injustices. Within 48 hours, an avalanche of sealed complaints, archived reports and long-forgotten student testimonies flooded the inboxes of national media outlets. The suit provided a legal hook, a trigger, for voices that had been told to wait. Documents surfaced, evaluation sheets where black students were marked unfit, too quiet, or needs more participation. Phrases never applied to white students. Emails from past teaching assistants recalled how Langston dismissed group projects from minority students, quietly rerouting them to labs he considered safer. Internal memos from department chairs described certain names as good for the optics, not good for the program. One email read, "Can we just keep a few tokens every year, so reviews don't look bad?" It didn't name individuals, but every name crossed off was black. At Harvard, walls that once echoed with mathematical certainty began to tremble under the weight of guilt. Faculty lounges buzzed with hushed anger and fear. Some faculty tried to distance themselves from Langston. One senior professor forwarded the lawsuit to the university ethics board with the message, "If this goes public, better us than him." Another quietly removed his name from upcoming conferences. The reputational risk was greater than the cost of silence. Meanwhile, student groups, those once silent, those who had watched Keenan walk in shadows, found their voices. The Black Students' Union, released an open letter calling for a full external audit of the STEM program's admission and evaluation policies. Student newspapers published diaries from alumni, describing how their brilliance was dismissed, their confidence broken, their dreams redirected to safer paths. One former participant recalled being told, during lab selection, that your kind was better suited for support staff than research. The words stung then. They cut deeper now. Keenan, still avoiding public interviews, read all of it silently in his dorm room. His eyes traced testimonies like geometric proofs, connecting points of pain, pattern after pattern. He didn't respond publicly. He didn't need to. The exposure itself was the message. In the middle of this chaos, an unexpected twist emerged. A faculty assistant, the same one who had leaked initial documents, handed a thick envelope to a national investigative journalist. Inside was a video file, labeled Langston off record 2. The journalist uploaded it to a secure server and encrypted its path. Then, in a small Zoom meeting with trusted colleagues, they pressed play. The video opened with a closing seminar session. The classroom was empty except for Langston and a handful of black students, all of them seated at the edges. The camera, hidden in a bookshelf, was blurry, but the audio was clear. Langston's tone that day was low, contemptuous, almost bored. He clicked a slide showing a coding formula, then surveyed the room and sneered. "You ask for inclusion," he said coldly, addressing the black students. "But brilliance isn't about quotas, it's about grit, and you wouldn't know grit if it punched you in the face." He paused, then louder, "Don't think you're here because you earned it. You're tokens, and tokens get used up." A student, young, quiet, attempted to respond, but Langston cut her off. "Save it," he said. "Your silence is more believable anyway." Then he nodded toward the door. "That's your exit." The words echoed like a verdict. The video ended. The room went silent for minutes. The investigators stunned, the journalist's hands trembling over the keyboard. The final frame froze on Langston's face, eyes cold and narrow, not of anger but of disdain. When the clip was released publicly the next morning, the internet did not respond with shock. It responded with fury. Headlines screamed. Comment sections overflowed. Academic boards at colleges far beyond Harvard condemned the behavior. Protests erupted, not only on campus but at satellite high schools across the country. Students reluctant to apply to STEM fields found the courage to speak out. An entire generation felt seen. And at the center of it stood Keenan, not as a lone child, but as the symbol of every silenced voice in academia. He had never shouted, he had never demanded, but the world finally asked, who taught them to stay quiet? Harvard attempted damage control. The university released a statement, expressing deep concern, promising thorough review, equating the video to allegations requiring careful adjudication. It paused all of Langston's pending publications and teaching assignments. The ethics board convened. Investigators arrived at Langston's office, collected records, cameras, old assignments, even the chalkboard evidence from the studio show. Langston, once arrogant and untouchable, was now caged in bureaucracy. But even as the institution moved, something unexpected happened outside its walls. Major tech firms, philanthropists, think tanks, many that once donated quietly to Harvard, began withdrawing pledges. Some publicly stated they could no longer associate with institutions tolerating systemic bias. Others promised new funding for alternative STEM programs, ones led by black educators, by community organizers, by independent researchers. The narrative had shifted. Harvard was no longer the center of academic power. It was the example of what happens when brilliance meets prejudice. The pressure overwhelmed the university board. The dean released a temporary hold on any disciplinary action related to admissions or evaluations. He called for public hearings involving students, alumni, faculty, independent scholars, and community leaders. For the first time in decades, the legacy of the summer STEM program, once shielded behind prestige and stone walls, was laid bare. Through it all, Keenan remained an enigma. He did not attend the hearings. He avoided cameras. But people talked about him. His name became a rallying point. Across social media, new hashtags formed. Silence is not absent. Black genius is real. Erase the erased. Online forums and educational platforms began reorganizing, offering scholarships, mentorships, and support to black and brown students without requiring them to perform for acceptance. The ripple effect was real. In the student dorms, those once complicit in excluding him began to apologize, privately at first, then publicly. One senior who had mocked him was quoted in the college paper. "I saw silence as weakness. I was wrong. For some it was too little. For others, it felt like hope. At least now the silence was acknowledged." Yet not everyone embraced the change. A small number of faculty, not all white, not all supporters of Langston, whispered about damage to reputation, false narrative, overreaction, and mob justice. They weren't outright denying the allegations, but they questioned the accuracy of memories, the validity of anonymous testimony, the fairness of putting decades of careers on trial for unverifiable bias. Their quiet resistance signaled that the fight was far from over. Inside his dorm, at night, Keenan stared at the ceiling. The noise had stopped, but the weight remained. He closed his eyes, breathing slowly. He thought not in equations, but in obligations, not in proofs, but in purpose. Because what he had done with chalk, on a glass board, had cracked more than a logic problem. It had cracked open secrets built on silence. And now, for the first time, the world was listening. A secret video surfaces, showing Langston mocking black students behind closed doors. The public panel was set in a grand auditorium, lights dimmed, soft hum of anticipation weaving through the audience. Thousands of silent cameras waiting. Behind the stage, a narrow corridor opened to a small room where Keenan Booker was led. He wore a simple dark jacket and jeans. Not flamboyant, not seeking applause. He hiked slowly, methodical, as though every step was measured to silence doubt. The air around him felt charged, not because of noise, but because of what had remained unsaid for so long. In the auditorium, strangers settled into seats, representatives from every corner of academia, from media houses, from civil rights organizations, all watching. For once they weren't waiting for him to prove he could solve something. They were waiting to see whether he would speak, or whether silence would speak for him again. Lights brightened. The stage glowed. A moderator stepped forward, but before any question was posed, the clamoring expectation froze. Instead of stumbling, Keenan remained motionless for a moment, chest rising, breathing calm. Then he turned to face the crowd, not with an expression of arrogance, not with a plea for validation, but with the weight of accumulated invisibility behind his eyes. He lifted his hands slightly, not to wave, but as if acknowledging every person who had overlooked him. And then he spoke. Not a flood, not a speech, not paragraphs in perfect cadence, just one sentence. A single sharp statement that cut through 2 decades of silence. It did not need flourish. It did not need applause. It simply landed. The room exhaled. Cameras blinked. Reporters stopped typing. For a moment the world loosened its noise, enough to make the silence matter. That sentence, raw, precise, irreducible, became the most replayed clip of the year. It wasn't about numbers or proofs or logic. It was about belonging. It was about being seen. That one line reframed everything. Not as a demand, but as a recalibration of how brilliance and worth were measured. Screens across continents paused. People rewatched. Some wept. Others sat in stunned quiet. It was as if the air itself had shifted, from suffocation to clarity. In the days following the panel, the momentum didn't fade. It swelled. Online threads exploded. Commentators dissected the layers of meaning in that one sentence. Students at distant universities posted it on dorm walls. Black parents and communities long denied academic encouragement told their children, keep silent until they learn to listen. Professors re-examined their syllabi. Admissions offices scribbled notes. Foundations rethought scholarships. Suddenly the invisible architecture that had ignored Keenan was collapsing under the visible weight of truth. At Harvard, reality hit with the force of a storm. In corridors where silence once reigned, whispers turned into open conversations. The dean's office received memos, complaints, testimonies. Former students reached out. Some said they never spoke up before. Some said they had and were silenced. Internal auditors walked through labs, archives, records of admission files. Documents surfaced, application essays, judged for tone, recommendation letters flagged for sincerity. Faculties whose names rarely appeared in academic journals but often in feeder networks. Names previously safe under prestige, now shifted under the glare of accountability. And at the center of it all stood Keenan, but only sparingly. He didn't chase headlines. He didn't give interviews. He didn't sign autographs. He cataloged. He drew. In a small room donated by alumni supporters, he laid out a web of data, applications, admissions, scholarships, dropout rates, race demographics, pattern density of dismissals. For every number, a name. For every name, a story. Over the weeks, the dataset grew. It became more than a protest. It became evident. Rodney visited often. He watched Keenan work in silence, sometimes not even glancing up when someone knocked on the door. Once Rodney asked whether Keenan wanted recognition. The answer was in the quiet turning of pages, the steady scribbling of numbers, the way he traced a curve on the wall that connected systemic exclusion to human potential lost. Recognition wasn't the goal. Reconstruction was. Elsewhere, the legal team representing former students opened a civil inquiry. The lawsuit by Langston had triggered the floodgates, but now a broader civil case was brewing, not just for an individual professor's misconduct, but for systemic bias and institutional negligence. Harvard's board convened emergency sessions. Trustees reviewed financial flows, alumni donations, scholarship funnels, faculty hiring patterns. The term institutional rot echoed among men whose names once decorated buildings and endowed chairs. National media ran profiles, feature story after feature story, on forgotten children whose grades soared but whose moral rights were dismissed, on community tutors who saw logic and compassion extinguished by disinterest, on parents who had tried everything and still failed because silence was mistaken for absence. Keenan's single sentence at the panel became the hinge. The equations he once solved became footnotes. The proof on the glass board became a symbol, but the human cost, the untapped minds, the hushed talents, the erased names, became the charge. At a small rally outside Harvard's main gates, a diverse crowd held placards with that sentence printed in bold. When you don't listen to silence, you erase lives. Students, alumni, activists, educators, black, brown, white, stood together. One university chancellor visited and declared an overhaul. A philanthropic foundation pledged funds for reparative scholarships. For the first time in years, admission booths in underrepresented neighborhoods reopened, promising opportunity without audition. Community centers across cities reported record applications, and still the institution, facing the storm, tried to respond. A press release acknowledged past failings. A commission was formed to audit discrimination and admission procedures. Policies were redrawn. Faculty training seminars were scheduled. New oversight boards promised transparency. For the first time, some doors opened. Then came the unexpected twist. Amid celebration and cautious optimism, a senior trustee sent a discreet memo to the dean's office. Consider preemptive academic reconstruction. Appoint a young professor in the STEM program to signal commitment. Behind closed doors, they deliberated. Names floated, but one stood out. A name no one inside the walls had expected. Keenan Booker. The idea rippled outward. Internal advisors argued. Critics raised eyebrows. It was unprecedented. A teenager, a high school-age student, being offered a professorship at one of the world's oldest universities. It sounded absurd. It sounded symbolic. It felt like a trap, but for many, it felt necessary. Keenan's name surfaced in drafting committees. Pedagogical boards reviewed bylaws. A handful of senior professors threatened resignations. Some alumni groused publicly. This undermines standards, they said. Others applauded quietly. Finally, they murmured, justice doesn't need waiting years anymore. On a gray evening, as autumn leaves swirled down crimson paths through Harvard Yard, an official letter arrived at the dorm where Keenan lived. It bore the university's seal, signed by the provost. It was an offer, a professorship, a position in the new inclusive mathematics and logic innovation department. Salary, benefits, access to library privileges, a small research lab, mentorship stipend, all of it, allocated as though he were a graduated scholar applying for a postdoc. But Keenan was still a teenager, still enrolled in his first full academic year, still underage. In the quiet of his room, he opened the envelope with slow fingers. He didn't exclaim. He didn't celebrate. He just held it, weighed it, then placed it gently on his desk beside the wall chart, beside the protest banisters, beside the notebooks filled with code and context. For a long time, nothing moved, not his eyes, not his breath. Then he reached over to a blank page on the wall chart and wrote, in fine pencil, recognition without transformation is a trophy in a locked room. He stepped back, closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them fast. The resolve was visible in the slight tightening around his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the clarity in his stare. He didn't need to accept the professorship. But the offer was the cliff opening, a turning point. If he took it, he'd be Harvard's first black teenage professor in history. If he refused, he'd challenge every silent promise made today. Regardless, he wouldn't disappear. He walked to the window, gazed out at the campus grounds, the historic brick, the ivy, the glowing lampposts under misty night. Outside, a small group of students lingered, reading the placards from the rally earlier. Their shadows stretched long under yellow light, reaching into the past as much as the future. Somewhere beyond gates and paperwork, a new conversation had begun. One about who gets to teach, who gets to learn, who gets to belong. Keenan turned away from the window. The envelope lay open on the desk. The world expected a signature. They expected acceptance. They expected him to join. But he hesitated. Not because he doubted the offer. Because he questioned the term. He picked up the letter, held it above the desk lamp, and watched the words shift in the glow. Then he closed his eyes. Harvard offers Keenan a professorship, while still a teenager. Light filtered through the high windows of the renovated lecture hall. Dust motes dancing like memories, finally given shape. In that room, with its chalkboards clean and desks realigned into open clusters instead of rigid rows, a new kind of class began. It was not simply math, not merely code, but a curriculum built by and for those whom the old institutions had silenced. The class belonged not to privilege or pedigree, but to promise and purpose. At the front of the room stood Keenan Booker, no longer the silent outcast, but the architect of a new beginning. He surveyed the students, faces from Detroit, Houston, New Orleans, Oakland, and inner-city Baltimore. Many had ridden buses for hours. Some had flown on borrowed tickets. All arrived clutching old notebooks, second-hand laptops, scribbled concept cards, or nothing at all. None wore the neat polos or pressed shirts of private school kids. Instead, they came in hoodies, work boots, hooded jackets, everyday clothes belonging to everyday people whose minds had been ignored or underestimated. Keenan didn't begin with theorems or proofs. He began with a question drawn plainly on the board in chalk. What is logic if the world won't listen? No student answered out loud, not yet. Instead, they stared at the question, and the weight settled in the air like gravity. For decades, they had been told silence was complicity, quiet was wrong, and brilliance needed validation before it could breathe. Here they were offered a different frame, silence as space, not void, logic as liberation, not test, self-belief as enough, not a ticket. Over the next hours, the course unfolded like a manifesto. Keenan guided them through coding languages, recursive logic, pattern recognition, but always with context, how these tools could reclaim voices, narrate histories, build platforms. Modules included not just algorithms, but the history of exclusion, systemic bias in academic testing, the mathematical erasure of black minds. Students learned to write loops and functions, but also to code data that visualized inequality. They sketched flowcharts, not only for software but for social systems, and in those charts they mapped oppression, then traced paths to dismantling it. In the back of the room, a young woman from Memphis carefully adjusted her glasses as she stared at her screen. She had grown up tethered to factory shifts and babysitting siblings, never believing she could belong to logic or science. Now she typed lines of code that filtered demographic data by school district, income level, graduation rate. She watched the numbers tumble, revealing patterns she had seen all her life and never had language for. A boy from Houston, whose English teacher once told him he'd never pass freshman math, debugged a recursive function that predicted economic mobility trends across zip codes. By the end of the morning, tears glinted in both of their eyes. Not tears of despair but of recognition. Recognition of power returning to the overlooked, the underestimated, the erased. Keenan watched quietly, moving among them like a ghost turned guardian. Hands tucked into his pockets, posture relaxed but alert. He didn't speak more than necessary. He let their work speak. He let their code compile. The silence was deliberate, respectful. It was space for them to think, and more importantly, to believe. Outside, in the corridors and cafeterias, word spread. There's a new class in the East Wing. Students posted brief messages in group chats. Black Logic Lab starting. Anyone in? A few came out of curiosity. Others came out of desperation. By the second week, the room was full every afternoon. Some nights, when campus was quiet and dorms empty, lights stayed on in that hall. A beacon. Old math students peeked in. Tutors stopped by. Some offered help. Others offered sympathy. But no one dismissed what was happening. In one corner of the hall, Rodney pushed a janitor cart past the open door and paused. He stood silently in the light, watching a circle of 5 students poring over a dense block of pseudocode. Their voices were low, earnest, voices that had spent years echoing in empty rooms, voices that now formed harmony. For the first time, Rodney realized that he wasn't just cleaning halls at Harvard, he was watching creation, a new kind, and maybe healing. As the weeks passed, the curriculum expanded. A module on data ethics confronted the misuse of algorithms in policing and credit scoring. A workshop on documentary logic asked students to write data-driven essays, not for assignments, but for communities. One project analyzed school testing bias across counties. Another modeled resource gaps in public libraries. Another exposed environmental hazards layered over historically marginalized neighborhoods. They didn't just compute, they contextualized. They coded justice. Keenan assigned them capstone projects, not for grades, but for real impact. Students collaborated across states. One built a platform connecting underfunded high schoolers to volunteer tutors. Another created a visualization map of eviction filings versus city resources. Another coded a chatbot for legal aid information for tenants facing displacement. Each was messy. Each needed refinement, but each was alive. Each started as a whisper. And in that classroom, whispers were given weight. Meanwhile, news outlets began to catch wind of the lab's existence. First as a curiosity, teen math prodigy starts grassroots classroom at Harvard. Then as a movement, Black students code justice in new initiative. Then as a reckoning, is this the future of STEM? Social media buzzed with reactions. Some were skeptical. Could a summer lab change centuries of academic bias? Others were hopeful. Maybe this was the blueprint for something larger. At Harvard's administration offices, eyes flicked nervously between calendars, donor reports, scholarship sheets. They counted weeks. They drafted memos. They ran projections. Some considered shutting the lab down. Others feared the backlash. If they tried, they realized that this wasn't just a program. It was a paradigm shift. Then came the unexpected twist. A scholarship fund from an unexpected source. A nonprofit foundation based in Atlanta, named the New Logic Trust, wired funds to the lab's account. The letter read, "For community rebuilding through code and truth." The grant covered hardware, textbooks, travel support for students from low-income backgrounds, even stipends for those working part-time. It meant the lab could expand, accept more students, provide meals, perhaps even offer stipends. Keenan hadn't applied. He didn't need to. The foundation's trustees had watched the broadcast. They had seen the data leak. They had read the civil inquiry filings. They had heard the call, and they answered it. That injection of support fueled the lab. Class expanded to evenings. Memory networks, graphic interfaces, collaborative code sessions spilled into weekends. Students with jobs or siblings to care for found new hope. Parents who once told their children to fit in now told them to stand out. The labs were no longer confined to one room. Pop-up classes emerged in community centers, churches, even public libraries in cities where some of the students lived. Internet cafes became classrooms. Panic rooms became coding hubs. The movement spread beyond Harvard's walls. Keenan didn't sit in the limelight. He remained behind the screens, adjusting access permissions, mentoring one-on-one, encouraging quietly, pushing gently. He rarely spoke to reporters. If asked for sound bites, he turned them down. Instead, he sent edited lecture modules with subtitles, anonymous and free to download. He wasn't building fame. He was building infrastructure. Rodney visited often, carrying coffee and clean whiteboards, staying late just to witness the quiet insurgency rising in chalk, code, clicks, and community. Once, after a long night of debugging lines of code, a young woman from Detroit, hair tied back, eyes red from screen glare, looked at Rodney and asked for advice. Not about logic, about life, about what it meant to believe you could exist in spaces that never asked if you belonged. Rodney didn't have words, but he nodded. And in that nod was recognition, solidarity, hope. By autumn, the lab had over 40 enrolled students. Alumni of elite prep schools sneered. Professors questioned credentials. Some donors pulled support, but more poured in. Grassroots organizers, community educators, independent scholars. Because the lab had become more than a class, it was a catalyst for reclamation. And then, one crisp November evening, As golden leaves clustered under lampposts along Harvard Yard's walkways, an envelope arrived for Keenan. The return address was embossed in gold letters: the White House Office of Innovation and Equity. Inside was a single parchment invitation. No explanation, no demand. Just an address, a date, and a phrase underlined twice: discuss the future of STEM equity. Keenan closed the envelope slowly, his fingers trembling, not with fear, but with weight. Outside the window, the late-night campus was quiet. But inside, the air crackled with possibility. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He didn't speak. He simply folded the parchment and placed it next to the new Logic Trust letter, right beside the wall chart where the data, the code, the faces and the stories lived. And then he traced, with a pencil, a small spiral in the margin. A mysterious invitation arrives from the White House. The night the medal came, the auditorium lights glowed soft and golden, as if hesitant to outshine the moment. The stage looked small under the domed ceiling, but the gathered crowd made it feel vast. A sea of faces rising in unison, not in applause but in weight. Eyes trained on a single figure, still, quiet, deliberate. That figure was Keenan Booker, 17, standing in the hush like a sculpture waiting to be unveiled. For years he had lived under the burden of expectation and erasure. Now the burden shifted to those watching him. As the officials stepped forward to present the national medal, an honor rarely given to someone so young, under such circumstances, the weight of history pressed. The medal hammered softly against cloth as it was pinned to his jacket. In that echo, countless silent minds seemed to stir. The children denied access because they were quiet, the former students whose brilliance had been dismissed, the logic buried beneath bias, the code erased under prejudice. The medal was more than recognition. It was restitution. No speech followed. Protocol dictated a short address. But in that hall the silence held more gravity than words. No one expected applause. Instead, the gathering exhaled together. Not relief, but reckoning. Cameras flashed, but only for record, not for spectacle. This was not a performance. It was a monument. Outside, under the night sky, a statue stood unveiled. Bronze, heavy, simple. A representation of a young black boy, seated beside a chalkboard, filled with solved problems. The figure's posture was steady, calm. The chalkboard behind him was locked in time, its surface etched with spirals, vectors, patterns, the same spiral vector proof that had shaken institutions and challenged prejudice. The pen beside him remained untouched. It was not forgotten. It was a reminder. Brilliance sometimes needs nothing but belief. In the crowd gathered for the unveiling, there were tears. Some silent, some quiet. Mothers placed hands over their hearts. Fathers straightened backs. Elders nodded as if recalling long-ago dreams. For many it was more than a tribute. It was a beacon. It whispered, "Your thoughts matter. Your silence can build. Your mind belongs." Among them stood a little girl, 8, maybe 9, holding her mother's hand tightly. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the bronze statue and its silent power. Across the years she had heard stories of what a genius kid looked like. Loud, confident, polished, always speaking up. But now, under the statue's shadow, she saw something different. A young boy who had never spoken, never demanded, never asked permission, and now he stood immortalized. She leaned toward her mother, voice low, trembling with awe and hope, and said she wanted to be like him. Her mother squeezed her hand firmly. The night held its breath. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed into the soft glow of streetlights, the new campus quiet held an edge of possibility. The statue stood under lamps, casting long bronze shadows against stone. The chalkboard behind it glinted faintly, not as trophy but as mirror. A mirror for every unseen mind. A mirror for every quiet student told to stay silent. A mirror for every erased name. Inside a small lecture hall nearby, the lab that Keenan had built, code and context, logic and justice, hummed with a new rhythm. Students sat not as newcomers learning from a prodigy, but as collaborators, thinkers and builders. New faces arrived, pushed by hope instead of expectation, by curiosity instead of approval. Many carried nothing but hunger. Hunger to think, hunger to know, hunger to exist. Professors at Harvard walked those corridors now with cautious steps. Some passed the lab door quickly, heads back. Others paused, glanced at the chalkboard mural outside the statue, at the names and equins etched below the bronze figure, at the long list of eliminated prejudices, and left slowly, as if reconsidering every choice they'd made. Legacy buildings loomed overhead, but now their shade felt thin, inadequate. The foundation beneath them had cracked. In classrooms across America, high schoolers unrolled new posters, the statue's silhouette, a chalk spiral, and the words beneath, "Silence becomes proof." Guidance counselors replaced old pamphlets about expected behavior with one new question for every student. What if your silence is a space, not a void? Late-night coding sessions popped up in church basements, community centers, basement gyms, places that once were never associated with logic or STEM. Black and brown kids, unpolished shoes on concrete floors, fingers tapping keys under fluorescent lights, building what institutions refused them, proof that brilliance cannot be denied. Keenan rarely walked through campus now. The statue stood outside the main quad, a daily reminder. He wasn't there for admiration. He avoided the fanfare. Instead, he sat in the lab, watching lines of code cascade across screens. He reviewed student portfolio. He tested models predicting resource inequity, mapping access against opportunity. He worked not as a hero, but as a guardian of potential. One evening, Rodney came by with 2 mugs of coffee and set one beside Keenan's keyboard. He watched him scroll through data, metrics of inequality, zip code by zip code, comparing graduation rates, technology access, college acceptance. Then he cleared his throat softly and said, not with voice raised, but with weight, "This wasn't just math anymore. This was justice." Keenan nodded once, without looking up, his eyes focused on a map of structural disparity. He erased one cell, recoded another. A spiral appeared on screen, the same signature shape, but now nested inside a larger framework. Equity curves, opportunity vectors, closure loops. The chalkboard on the wall behind him carried no names, only code, only shadows, only possibility. But even monuments and labs cannot rewrite memory overnight. Outside the campus gates, headlines began to rattle. Some celebrated the transformation, others questioned it. Has excellence been redefined? Is this lowering standards? Are we sacrificing rigor for representation? Social media chat rooms lit up with arguments. Some academic forums worried about credential inflation. Some alumni opined on heritage, tradition, merit. Inside the lab, Keenan did not respond to the noise. But some nights he would look out the narrow window above his desk at the statue below, at the bronze figure sealed in timeless inclusion, and for a moment, the streetlights would catch the chalkboard behind it, making the patterns glow faintly, as though alive. On one such night, a letter arrived. Handwritten, informal, unsentenced. The envelope was simple, sealed with no markers. The only hint of origin was a faint logo in the top corner. A National Arts Fellowship dedicated to young voices reshaping American identity. Inside the letter was a certificate, Youth Chainmaker Grant. It named Keenan by full name, recognized not only for mathematical brilliance but for cultural impact, community leadership, and systemic redefinition of excellence. It granted funds enough to expand the lab equipment, provide scholarships, host nationwide workshops for underrepresented youth. Keenan didn't display the certificate. He slipped it inside a notebook, under a blank page, next to the original outline of OpenSolve, the curriculum blueprint he drafted months ago. He didn't celebrate. He simply kept walking toward the window, toward the statue, toward the code. That night, the campus lay quiet. The bronze statue stood under moonlight. The lab glowed softly inside. Somewhere far away, sirens sounded, not of crisis, but of possibility. Communities in other cities read the headlines, saw the patterns, opened their notebooks. Open soft copies appeared on GitHub. Requests for mentorship poured in. New students logged on, new minds ready to build. And in Cambridge, in the half-lit lab, Keenan typed one final line into his data model. Not public, not for acclaim, just a quiet function, looping through variables of access, race, heritage, opportunity, and time. At the bottom of the code, he left a comment, for every invisible mind, a visible path. He paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard, then pressed enter. The model ran. The output a map of potential, of unlocked futures, spread across the screen in soft green lattices, futures flickering into life. He closed his eyes. The lines on his face softened. Outside, the statue stood still. The chalkboard behind it glowed faintly under streetlights. The spirals and vectors a silent signature. Under the bronze figure lay the names, not only of those who had believed him, but those who once refused. Somewhere in the crowd that night, under the stone streetlight and soft hush of autumn leaves, a young black girl held her mother's hand. She looked up at the statue, at the silent boy forever captured in bronze, pen untouched, chalkboard alive, her eyes wide, heart pounding. She whispered again, not a demand, not a challenge, just a seed planted. She wanted to be like him, not to prove, not to respond, but to belong, because he had shown the world that sometimes silence isn't absence, sometimes it's power. A young black girl in the crowd whispers to her mother that she wants to be like him, and the echo begins. If you've ever been silenced, overlooked, or told you didn't belong, this story was for you. Because brilliance should never have to shout to be seen. Type yes if you believe in justice, and subscribe if this broke your heart.